that I got grief for saying we were going to have a 25-minute break, and here we are almost 45 minutes later. So I just feel compelled to share that. The first... the first item on our work session agenda is a grant application for Salt Lake City Consumer Protection Program. I think Sylvia and Mary Beth will be joining us at the tables. Mary Beth? Oh, yeah, there you are, Mary. Sorry. So Sylvia, can you tell us a little bit about this, and then we'll open it up for questions?
Yes, this is a grant application that the administration has, a grant program that the administration has applied for. It's through the Department of Finance, and it's a new program for 2 years. It's a new program for 2 years, and they're requesting 1 FTE for this grant program.
I'll just, if I could, just pop in with a process thing. We don't usually have briefings on grant applications. We usually just send them to the public hearing and then to consent agenda. But this one was enough of a sort of new program that has potential ongoing costs and a new kind of service offering by the city that we thought it makes sense to have a council discussion about it before moving forward.
And the administration has a presentation, so.
Mary Beth,
Hi.
welcome.
Welcome. Thank you. Welcome.
I understand you have a presentation for us.
Yeah, we'll go over this quick. Obviously, I'm not going to read every line. So this is a new grant. The grant is actually a W.K. Keller Foundation grant. The background on the grant is basically to improve customer financial stability by embedding financial empowerment strategies, policies, and programs into the local government infrastructure. This grant was a lengthy process. We started the initial application back in January, so almost a year ago. That initial application, after that initial application, they came back, and of 14 cities, they requested strategic plans, which included budgets. Of those 14 cities, 5 cities were selected, Salt Lake City being one of those, Denver, Nashville, Austin, and Boston. So the funding that we requested was actually $200,000, and the $125,000 is a negotiation right now. Since it is a new grant and a new program, they've never had this program before, we're still in negotiations, and could be revised at any point in time. So they're still working out their dollar amounts. It's one of the reasons that it took us so long to get you the initial application, is because we didn't have an initial dollar amount for quite a while. The goals of the program is to collaborate with the Utah Division of Consumer Protection. Daniel was supposed to be here, and he ended up getting the flu, so we've met with the state on, I believe, 2 occasions pertaining to what the consumer protection program does at the state and how we can complement their program and help forward their initiatives as well as Salt Lake City's initiatives. Deter unfair, deceptive, and fraudulent business practices, encourage ethical business practices, exercise and expand municipal authorities, and empower consumers. The basic strategy for Salt Lake City would not to be punitive, but would be to incentivize ethical business practices. So the goal for this would be to incentivize ethical business practices, and it would be cross-departmental, which would include the attorney's office, police department, recorders, planning, and zoning. So the first-year approach would be to catalog the city's current approaches and the tools, including municipal codes, technology, and business practices. I believe one of the reasons that they were interested in Salt Lake City is because of our landlord-tenant program. And they've heard a lot of good things about the landlord-tenant program, so it's one of the reasons that they chose Salt Lake City. Modification of business license application procedure, including photo ID and Doppel verification, collecting consumer complaint data through the CRM, and cultivating outreach to customers. So one of the biggest things in this is advertising, empowering our consumers to know where they can go to report things, how they can make things better, and advertising for businesses as well. So the second year would be continue with collection of data, identify the gaps in state and local areas, and then develop regulations, at least local regulations, and there may be some state regulations as well. The pilot program will allow an understanding to address the gaps and create a plan forward for empowering and for businesses and consumers. We also have deliverables, performance measures, and anticipated outcomes. Those aren't provided in the PowerPoint slide, but if you'd like those, we can provide those to you as well. So why local consumer financial protection? Predator financial products and services are a new face of the economic injustice. Utah is top 3 state nationwide for fraud per capita. And the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau handles 6,700 consumer complaints. Of that, 47.8% are in Salt Lake City. How local government makes a difference. Salt Lake City is in a position to align its business licensing and civil enforcement authorities with state statute to ultimately change market behavior and address economic injustices. Business sectors such as landlord-tenant, towing, booting companies, home service contractors, offer low-hurdle opportunities to change market behavior. Business sectors of payday lending and door-to-door solicitation offer a number of barriers to change that place opportunities for marketing change in the long-term horizon. Questions?
That's all.
That's all.
That was fast. Thanks. Questions for Mary Beth? So I have a couple, maybe just get started. This is a new service proposed to be provided by Salt Lake City. It seems like consumer protection has the potential of expanding pretty rapidly. I could imagine the need out there is pretty significant. Can you talk a little bit about the specific target areas where you're thinking this might be appropriate from a city perspective?
So I think from the city perspective, towing has been one of our biggest areas. The towing companies, payday lenders, focusing more on the tenant initiatives. I think we've done a really good job with the landlord initiatives, but not so much educating our tenants. And educating consumers on all of these areas, right? There's got to be education on both sides, both business and consumer areas. But I think that those, the contractors, the state would really like us to focus on contractors because their statute only allows them to do certain things. But I think that would take some legislation change as well as some significant ordinance changes. But that's what this pilot is about, is to find those gaps. To figure out those gaps so that we can go forward. One of the things that I think we found is that there's no one central point, right? Consumers don't know exactly, especially in Salt Lake City, where that central point is if they have an issue with a business, and we have to refer them to the Consumer Protection Program. This way, I think that central point of contact will be significant for Salt Lake City.
So you imagine that this would be a program where we still would potentially refer people out to the appropriate entity, potentially state level, but at least they have a place where they can go to get the information. Is that how you?
Yeah, I think that's one of the areas.
But there may be some city-related activities too that.
Correct. I think long-term would be the same thing that we did with the civil enforcement, focusing on something similar to the civil penalties. Long-term, this is my vision long-term, right? It would be something similar to civil penalties. You would capture those civil penalties for the businesses that are not complying with state statute or city ordinances. You capture those, you put them into a fund that helps advertising, education, and hopefully self-funding this program. So, but that's, like I said, that's a long-term vision of mine, but until we get the analysis completed, I can't give you exact.
Yeah, and so a lot of the, I'm thinking of a similar sort of discussion around parking and actually trying to capture that general fund revenue that comes in from parking and put it back out to specific programs like pedestrian improvements or coordinated parking. But we've always had a real challenge carving off that general fund revenue into a very specific program. How's this going to be different?
Well, with it being new, it's easier, right? Because with it being
That's
new,
true. That's
it
true.
becomes easier for me to take that civil penalty and say, we are putting it here, and it will be used for this specific area.
We're not talking about a revenue stream at the level of parking.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not even close to the level of parking. Well, I hope not, right? I mean, I really hope not.
Yes, Aaron Mendenhall.
The last point on your slide here around payday lending and door-to-door soliciting, I'm having trouble with the language. Can you, I know that those industries have a pretty significant lobbying component to them. Is that the kind of significant barriers you're talking about?
I think that there's quite a few barriers for payday lending, especially solicitation. Solicitation, we have a lot of problems with solicitors not coming into business licensing and getting the correct licenses. So I think that those are the areas that we would like to focus on, is being better in Salt Lake City with how we monitor those. Not so much, and it may take legislation, right? This is new, and these are new ideas for us, but one of the things that we found when we were researching this is the areas that are the weakest right now for the consumer protection, as well as Salt Lake City, are the new ideas. Financial is huge. Financial advisors, those types of things really go under the radar, but consumers are not protected.
This is probably a reach, but I wonder if you're aware of any kind of research around the country that might correlate density of payday lenders in an area with incidents of reported fraud or bankruptcy or any other kind of unhealthy financial scenarios for residents.
I'm not, we can find it out, we can look for it. I don't know off the top of my head.
Interested for a while and heard an idea around limiting the number of payday lenders in a certain area, that there'd be some kind of proximity ordinance. But I've not seen data, so if you come across any in this work that I think you'll be doing, I think we would be interested to hear that. If they're, I'm not sure we can correlate it, but
Okay.
thanks.
Mr. Chair?
Lisa?
Along those lines with payday lenders, I would really like to see us be able to decrease those dramatically, if not get rid of them. But don't we run into a problem with trying to regulate them in terms of the state? Is that a
Well,
state
that's what
legislation? So
when we find
we'd
these
work with them.
gaps, the gaps will probably take, I don't know yet, but I would assume there may be some legislation that we'd have to work through.
Okay, thanks.
James?
Yeah, tell me how this would affect nuisance hotels or motels. Would this have any, would this help at all with that? You know, it's something that we're battling right now. We discussed it in the RDA.
It
I'm wondering
is,
how this would be able to tie
yeah.
them to it as well.
I'm not sure, James. I will have to think about it. But you're right, it is, and especially the nuisance hotels that are what I would call predatorial to lower income individuals. And I'm not sure, but that may be we may have to look at that, right, and see what that does. I think, you know, with civil enforcement penalties that you passed in last fiscal year. I think, you know, with incorporating those into this in the long run for the plan, I think that may help as well as those.
How would we get that information? You just ask them and they would reply to you saying, yes, this would work or not, or how could we get that information?
What information?
In regards to if this really would apply to nuisance hotels?
I think we'd have to think about through the process and see. But I think I can get that information to you. I just haven't thought about nuisance hotels, so I think that we'd have to look through that. It wasn't in our strategic plan, doesn't mean we can't add it into our strategic plan, nuisance hotels. What we did is when we went to the state consumer protection, they said, we think these areas you could help us with. And we said, okay, let's take the easiest first
Right.
and start with them first. But nuisance hotels may be one of those options as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, James. Andrew?
Thanks. It sounds like there's a couple pieces of this. There's consumer education, it sounds like, and information sharing to increase capacity to make good decisions or give options available and when you're in difficult circumstances. Sounds accurate. There's a second piece about how do we enforce or how do we limit the predatory issues. Give me a sense, you said you had a list of outcome measures you're going to be tracking. Give me a sense of what those may look like. In 2 years, what do we hope to be different, I guess? What would you see?
So one of the things is the city's increased in technical capabilities to administer and license processing and exercise civil authority and use self-funding authority to maintain fair marketplace practices. And then to empower businesses to exercise right and responsibility in the marketplace. To the city increased technical capacity to engage consumers and businesses in deterring unfair, deceptive, and fraudulent business practices. And the city integrates use of analysis of consumer complaint data to inform enforcement tools and authorities to deter fraudulent business practices.
It sounded like from your discussion earlier that one of the things you look at would be what are the requirements for folks who are in business to have DOPL background checks, those kind of things. Is that accurate as well? You'd have a sense of percentage of folks who actually have those, or how the city enforces that?
Currently, certain areas of business have require a photo ID, but not all businesses require photo ID and DOPL. I think that is some area that we are looking at focusing on. It's better for the nuisance hotels, and I think that that works with this, but also works separately, right? If we didn't go with this, I would still propose the photo IDs, because I think that it's an important thing for us to have a photo ID of somebody that's responsible. The city has never done that before. It's kind of a different paradigm shift. But we have seen in the past, and I'm hoping that civil penalties help, where they continue to move owners, right? This owner, and then they sell it for $1 and it goes over here, and they sell it for $1 and it goes over here. With a driver's license and a DOPL, I'm hoping that deters some of that on top of the civil penalties.
Okay. Would it also be a way for the citizens of Salt Lake City to have easier access to do checks on who they're hiring for certain jobs? I'm not thinking of like an Angie's List, but if you're looking for a contractor or someone like that, or where do I get help with, say, short-term lending, loans, those kind of things, would this be a way to access that for consumer sort of empowerment, or is that not sort of the scope you're thinking of?
No, I don't think I think that could be part of the scope of this, especially for the contractors. I didn't even think about it until you said it, but that's part of the problem with the contractors, is that it's not so much the regular contractors and what they're doing, it's the people that they're picking up Angie's List and how the state can enforce some of those consumer protections. So yes, I think that is great information for a consumer, right? Is to use the information that we produce and say, use these contractors, because these contractors are good contractors. Right?
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Beth. I think one of the concerns that I hear you say you're going to track going forward is that a lot of the issues we're going to identify in this process are not going to be things that the city can do anything about. So I think we need to know that information and those gaps between what we legally can provide in the way of a response or service and what we're seeing as the challenge or the problem out there in the community are going to be really helpful going forward. So
that, and as well as the gaps in ordinances and
Right.
legislations.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
This item is on for public hearing tonight. Do you want to?
This is part of our public hearing this evening.
Yes.
And then I believe it'll be on for action at a future date.
Yes.
Correct? Thanks. Thank you. The next item on our agenda is item number 2. It's an ordinance, petition to amend provisions related to accessory dwelling units. We'll be joined by Nick Tarbett, Nick Norris, and Michael Malloy, I believe, and anybody else? So, Nick Tarbett, could you start and just tell us a little bit about where we are in this process and what we're considering?
Yes, I'd love to. Last week, the council conducted a series of straw polls regarding ADUs, and we are here to talk about those tonight. Since since we took the straw polls last week, the council's received some feedback from the community, expressing some concerns about a few of the straw polls and other general issues. So we can also talk about that tonight. One particularly was a concern about the proposed boundary. Some people are concerned that it might have some fair housing issues with it if the council goes forward with that. So we've provided that information to the attorney's office. They've been able to look at it and can help answer any questions to the best of their knowledge, since they've only had it for a few hours to this point.
Paul, I noticed you sitting back there. Could you join us just for a second? And I don't mean to put you on the spot with this, because certainly we're not looking for a legal opinion. We're just looking for your sort of first impressions on this since we just received it. Could you just give us a little background on what we received and maybe respond to questions?
So the Disability Law Center sent correspondence yesterday indicating their concerns about the boundary in light of the Fair Housing Act, particularly whether that boundary presents a barrier to protected classes being able to achieve housing in certain areas of the city. Like Nick indicated, my office has taken a preliminary look at that. We're delving into the research at this point.
Okay, any questions for Paul at this point that he may or may not be able to answer? All right. But before I give some time to Nick Tarbett, council members, I would like to put a proposal on the table for you. We've been having some very lengthy discussions about ADUs over the past 6 months, and even a little bit prior to that. And one of the concerns that I think has evolved in this process is that many of us in the community and many of us on the council are in very different places about this. In conversations with Nick Norris, I would like to propose for discussion a concept of actually sending the ADU ordinance back to the planning department to redefine, examine, and rework some of the concerns and issues that we've identified through our public process and through the public process that has happened through Open City Hall and several other forms of gathering information, for a modification that could come back to us. And Nick, this is where you need to stop me if I get out of bounds here. Sometime in the beginning of the next year, before the budget process. And Nick has indicated that that's an acceptable timeline. He thinks that the planning staff could do some significant reworking and resolve some issues that we're all experiencing and that the planning staff, in fact, is experiencing as well, and that they could have that back to us early in the year for reconsideration. So I'm just going to put that on the table for now. I want to see what you think about that, any questions you might have about that direction. I'm just going to open it up. So Derek,
Yeah.
and then Aaron.
Well, I'm warm to that proposal. I think that I'm looking at my packet here and noticing that it says 7th briefing of ADUs. Can you believe it?
Of this year.
7. I think we have really tried to come to a consensus on this really complicated topic because we know it is an important piece of our housing discussion. It's not the only piece by any means, but it's an important one. And I am concerned that we have created this big, clunky policy proposal that is just going to make things more challenging. And so I would like to get a response from the planning division on a lot of the concerns that we've raised over the last 6 briefings. And maybe they can come back to us with a simpler proposal, something that accommodates a lot of our concerns and maybe makes it easier for the residents of Salt Lake to understand and move forward with an ADU policy. So I'm supportive of this. I don't want to delay this any longer, any longer than necessary, because we have bigger housing fish to fry. But I do want this one to feel right so that we aren't constantly second guessing or concerned that maybe we haven't done it correctly. So I do support this. I'd like to hear what Nick from planning has to say, if you can respond to Stan's proposal and where we're coming from on this.
Yeah, I think first off, I think we have a lot of concerns with the current proposal. not just from issues that have been brought up, but simply from an administrative standpoint and how we would actually utilize it. And we probably should have done this earlier, but late last week I started going through it with more attention to that and identified a number of things that I think are problematic in the ordinance, and would make it difficult for us to actually administer it. And so working with Michael, we tried to find ways that we can simplify that and address those concerns. And so I think that we definitely, just 7 briefings, that's usually an indication that we're not getting it right. So let's put the brakes on it. Let's stop and think about it, and maybe we need to change direction. And
Are you
so-
suggesting it took us 7 times to figure out that this isn't quite what we want?
Well,
That's okay. if
Yeah,
you-
I think sometimes when you're trying something new, sometimes that's the case, right? And I think the important thing is that you figure it out before you put something in place that is actually harder to undo. And so that's kind of where we are. And I think that we would definitely welcome the opportunity to take a new approach with
So-
this
Mr.
zoning ordinance.
If I may just follow up really quick on that, what is a good time frame for your division? I realize that capacity is always an issue, but we want to move swift and we want to keep this a priority for this body.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that we have going on in our division that I think you guys need to be aware of. One, we have 2 staff members who are accepted positions in other communities or moving out of state, and so we're going to be down 2 people. It usually takes us, especially this time of year, we can't immediately go out and start the recruiting process, so that'll start in January. It usually takes us a couple months to do that, and then there's the catching up period. Those new, it is, unless somebody's coming from a larger city than Salt Lake, and most of our staff people come from inside Utah, it's a different atmosphere working and dealing with planning issues in Salt Lake City than anywhere else. So there's going to be some time there. We're in this position right now where we have a number of priorities that really are in the developmental stage. So they're in our office that I think we'll be able to keep moving forward. A lot of those deal with housing. They're basically really in 2 categories. I'd say one are removing housing barriers, which we're following up with the housing plan on that. And the other is addressing some of our more design-oriented development issues that have come up. We recognize that a lot of our zoning districts have a gap in design standards. And we're probably looking at starting more of a public process with some of those things. So it is going to be a little bit of a, it's going to add to our workload, definitely. The good thing is that we're in that time of year where our private applications are generally lower. And when they start to come in, usually it's February and March. And there's about a 6-week build up to when our work is really intensive on those. And so I think that we have a window that I think we can fit some things in.
So
but
Nick,
it's gonna be difficult.
If we're talking about a March, April timeline back to the council, do you feel that that's sufficient time?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Aaron?
Thank you. I feel relief at this proposal, and the harder we've worked this piece of clay, I think the farther the 7 of us have gotten on where we wish it would be and what we wish it would address. And just to take the clay analogy too far, I think it feels like we need less clay, that we've been working this thing into a huge mass. And I'm grateful that you feel like you have the capacity to take it back and hopefully clean it up, and also provide some ability to, I hope, catch projects that need some working and create a path for those concerns to be addressed with mitigation. That's what many of us have been asking for all along. So I feel greatly relieved, and I'll look forward to seeing this on an agenda really soon.
Thank you, Charlie, and then Lisa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Aaron, I'm gonna continue with your clay analogy, and but instead of just talking about molding clay, I would like to see that we actually develop something that's going to be a little bit stronger than what we've seen, and that will have some more predictability for existing neighborhoods, and also people who are interested in potentially looking at an ADU. And so I'd like to, have a kiln. I would like to use this process as a kiln, so don't come back to us with, a moldy, thing of clay. Please come back with something that's a little bit firmer. One of the things that I think has been lacking thus far is really what sort of process would be in place. And I know that, there has been some discussion about, having these go through a conditional use permit application process. Tell me a little bit about that and how that could work if we were to tie future accessory dwelling units to a conditional use process.
Yeah, so the benefit, obviously, I mean, there's pros and cons, right? And the biggest con is just time. Conditional uses take a little bit of time. Right now, I think our processing time for conditional use is right around 75 days. That's the biggest con. It's generally not as critical for these smaller types of things as it is for bigger types of things where business licenses are on the line and things like state approval of alcohol permits are on the line and things like that. The benefits of, the other kind of which something that can be viewed as a con depending on which side of the aisle you fall on is that, in Utah and also according to city ordinance, a conditional use has to be approved if the legal term, the detrimental impacts, can be mitigated. And that doesn't mean eliminated, that just means reduced, right? The benefit of that is that you can write standards of review, and we have a number of those in our ordinance already for the conditional uses. I think there's like 20 different detrimental impacts, some other standards about compatibility and things like that. But we can also, because this is a separate section of the ordinance, it's easier for us to address things like compatibility, building scale, parking, privacy in backyards. Those things, we have some options there that we can write some standards to help address those things. But perhaps the biggest benefit of a conditional use is that they're revocable. And if somebody's not complying with conditions of approval or standards in the ordinance, there's a process in the ordinance to revoke that.
Including owner occupied.
Including anything that's in there. So whether it's owner occupied, short-term rental, any of those things. If you have a standard in there to address that, you can revoke it for violating it.
Council members, I mean, that is one of the major issues that I've had with the ordinance that we've been debating thus far, because we do not have the enforcement ability to deal with a lot of the housing issues that we currently have on the books. And when dealing with Airbnbs and some of the other short-term rental issues that we're talking about, if we're truly trying to get to to try to increase our housing stock, that's what we need to be focused on. And so one of the things that I'm really I hesitate to say that I'm excited about something regarding an ADU, because this process has been going on so long. But I think this helps us get closer to where a lot of us have had different concerns. Now, they may be varying concerns, but I think in working together with planning over the next several months, we can actually come up with something that does address that housing component and the infill component that we want to talk about, without creating some unintended consequences or unenforceable issues that could be in place. So thank you for answering that question.
Thank you, Charlie. Lisa?
I have a follow-up to that, as well as a request. So if we went the conditional use route, would enforcement be by complaint?
Well, there's a certain element that always has to be by complaint, right? I mean,
Yeah.
It's one thing to be able to go by and see something. It's another to know what is actually occurring. So yeah, there will be a big component of that. But it's a little bit different when, at least in my experience, when neighbors know that something has a special approval and they know who to contact about a problem with it, then it's a lot different of an enforcement mechanism than it is for somebody, not blindly, but just, calling civil enforcement and lodging a complaint about noise.
Yeah.
Right. Much more
So
difficult.
it gives you more precise tools.
Right. And it also potentially puts that decision making, there's a process to revoke it, right? And so it's a citizen committee. The planning commission is the entity that can choose to revoke or not. And so it's a little bit different than just a regular old, call or email or letter to civic enforcement. That doesn't mean it's easy, but at least it's a different process that at least in my experience, we don't revoke a lot of conditional uses. But when you tell somebody that, look, this is going on, we have some evidence that it's valid, and you risk losing your
So
conditional use.
there's a clear pathway.
They're going to
There's a clear pathway
respond.
to address it, and there's a clear pathway to receive it.
Right,
if you
and
want it.
just as an example, just recently we had some complaints about a project that went through a special approval that required a certain amount of trees. Well, and this was approved 10 or 15 years ago. And at the time, it was a conditional use. It was a planned development, and there used to be conditional uses. Well, they cut their trees down. The neighbors remembered that conditional, and they caught us, and now the trees are back. They had to plant equal trees to maintain that, or they were going to lose their approval. So that's an example of how it might work.
Yeah, that's a good thing to hear about. My request also would be, and you perhaps have already done this, I found it really interesting to meet with Dr. Larice from the university and see what his graduate study group was discovering. And he said the ordinance we've been discussing for these 7 meetings, he felt like it was not a great ordinance, and he was recommending that we go back to you. And I feel like he's got some really good insight that I think you could tap into that might be of help given your shortage in staff, and that, not to adopt everything he's saying, but I felt like there was some really good meat there for you to work with.
I'm meeting with them on Thursday. So
You read my mind.
There you go.
Genius, thanks.
Andrew.
First up, thank you very much for taking on the task of revisiting it so quickly. You're maybe glossing over the difficulty of it perhaps a bit, but I appreciate it anyway.
thank you.
But I agree. I think a lot of, at least my thinking on this came from feedback from the professor and some of that work, including the willingness to sacrifice a boundary in order to get this moving forward so that we could revisit it and maybe expand it later on. But I would appreciate very much seeing what you say about conditional use, if this is an appropriate place for that, if it can be easily administered across the city a little more equally, and also enforced in a better way than other ways we have. So thank you very much. I just want to say that out again. I do, opposed to Charlie, I am excited about seeing this again very quickly. I do want to see it very quickly, and I'm excited to hear what you come back with, so thank you.
Okay, any other questions for the staff before us? So here's what I would like to propose, council members. I'd like to propose a straw poll that we send the ADU ordinance back to the planning department for modification and changes in particular related to recommendations that may consider a conditional use opportunity. Any questions about that? All those in favor, thumbs up. Any opposed? That's unanimous. That's all approved. Thank you. And I'm thinking about a March, April timeline. So Nick Tarbit's going to ride you on that. So I think we're good, right? Anything else you need, Nick?
We will need to look at the housing plan language, and we'll have proposals that will fit what's going on for next
Great.
week.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, you don't get a tentative break. Number 3, we are moving on to item number 4, which is the Transit Master Plan. We are joined by Russell Weeks on our staff And transportation is bringing, it looks like John? And additional staff or just you? Okay. Julianne, welcome. So Russell, could you sort of quickly tell us where we are, and then we'll jump to transportation department staff.
Well, you should have a council staff note in your red folders that's titled this, and what it is staff's latest attempt to find everything that the council sought, to find references to everything the city council sought to put in to the transit master plan at the November 14th briefing. Most of them, I mean, the first page and the top of the second page are the council staff's what the council wanted. Starting at the second page in the bold language is a response that's either from something sent to the council on November 20th or on December 4th. The items noted on December 4th are straight out of the revised master plan that they sent. So I guess the primary goal tonight is to find out whether the council is ready to adopt the master plan based on the revisions, or whether it wants to wait a week, or whether it wants to wait longer.
Well, there you go. John and Julianne, anything you want to add? Nothing at all.
We hopefully addressed all of your concerns and comments, and so we just want to know, whether or not you feel like your concerns or comments were addressed.
Questions? Everybody's nodding. That means they're all good? Or you have questions? Okay, all right, let's go to Aaron and then to Andrew.
All right, thank you for the feedback. I'm working through Russell's the policy questions and items on page 2, I think, of the packet.
And while Aaron's looking, so council members, this is tentatively scheduled for action this evening, but if there are enough, we wanted to see how this briefing goes, and if we get to a place where we're comfortable, then we could adopt it this evening with the modifications proposed, or if we need a little more time, we have it on the agenda actually for next week as well.
Well, this is fairly simple. If y'all can look under 3, under the first bullet point, I would like to propose that we strike the first sentence under that bullet point, which reads, while the plan is mode neutral and interest in what a streetcar network would look like was one motivating factor for the city council in funding this plan. I think that's an unnecessary statement. It might be true, but I think that it's sufficient to just say that the capital investment corridors with connection to existing rail corridors identified herein provide a framework for a potential streetcar network, and not have to include some political context at the time that's really sort of irrelevant in a long-standing document like we're going to have here.
So Aaron, let's do that in the context of a straw poll. Could you sort of state or do you have a response?
Julianne, did you want to respond?
I'm completely fine with doing that. I think it was partly because that framework was described to us, and I can remember this from early in the process, that there were questions. What does a streetcar network look like? And adoption of the S-line extension. In part, people were saying, okay, we're doing this, but we want to know what the full network looks like. I don't know that it's necessary to say that, though. I think that's a
So the proposal would be to strike
that sentence that begins with while the plan is mode neutral.
Mr. Chair.
Any questions? Yes, Charlie.
Not a question, just a comment. So I was the one that raised that point when we talked about this. I do agree that the time has passed. I don't think it's necessary that it be in there, so I do support Councilmember Mendenhall's straw poll to eliminate it.
Any other questions about the straw poll? All those in favor, thumbs up. Any opposed? Thumbs down. It's unanimous support, so we can
One
strike
more.
that. Yes, go ahead.
So under 6.6 on the next page, at the top there, the questions posed of whether or not the city council would like to limit the framework for the identification of potential streetcar corridors to include broad language emphasizing connections and not specific routes. And my understanding was that the consultant had produced some specificity in their document that was eliminated in the administrative review process. Is that correct? That we actually have the content with some specificity from their work?
We have, in general, the plan is a corridor plan, not a route plan. Just technically, it's a lot of specifics that you get into with route planning, but that said, we know roughly what corridors connect. And so in terms of the S-Line extension, it would jog over to 900 East. That's where it makes the most sense, and that we do know, and I think it's now reflected in the plan maps in that way. It's also something I last week asked the Wasatch Front Regional Council in their modeling for updating their regional plan. How does that look, the network as articulated? And they said it works really well. It performs well.
Okay.
And Aaron, I think, and I may have thrown up a little bit of a flag there, because my concern about being too specific, and this is a fine line, is that my sense is that we will absolutely have to go out to a public process in order to really draw those maps. And as soon as you say this is where it goes, then there's assumption that that's where it goes. And so I didn't want to preempt a public process that really defined where a route might be located when it gets to be on the ground.
So my view of the purpose of the work that the consultant has done is that it is a component of what is part of our final decision-making process, which is that they go through and they look at what our current patterns of transportation are for our residents, specifically, like where are we going today? Where are we going in single occupant vehicles that maybe we should consider transit of some sort? And that this is a technical analysis document that tells us what we're doing today and where transit could effectively intersect in a better way. And then we take that, and when the administration proposes funding something or a grant opportunity comes along, we bring the public process to say, here's what the technical analysis says would work best for our tax dollars in terms of the biggest bang for our buck for use. What do you think, people? So it doesn't feel like we're preempting a public process because the technical analysis said this is where people are driving a lot and this is where we should consider putting transit.
No, I'm fine with that sort of corridor language. I'm totally fine with that. I just got a little nervous about calling out like a specific alignment, because there are jogs in some of the places. I mean, the downtown is a good example. We've looked at a couple of options, and at some point we think it needs to jog over probably to South Temple, but the key is it on one of these couple of streets, it needs to get from downtown to the U, and I think that's totally appropriate in the master plan.
And I feel great with that instead of the specifics.
Okay. Any other questions?
I just wanted to say where we talk about WFRC. Let me see, where's that at? Of whether or not we should refer to the WFRC plans for more specific recommendations. And it seemed like that's what was an option here under the downtown streetcar connecting to the university section, where it says it might be noted that 3 transportation options the WFRC presented to the council in July include these options. So is that a way for us to
That's
say,
a heads up, because that's what's going to be taken to the public in 2018. That's, devising which one of those options or a combination of those options is what you were briefed on in July. And that's just sort of a heads up that this thing is coming your way.
So I guess I'm asking the question of whether or not the transit master plan right now sufficiently refers to other regional planning documents that might provide more, that are not at a 25-year planning level, that are at a more frequent planning level.
Yeah, so we have a section that talks about the relationship between this plan, which really focused on local needs, and the regional plan that focuses on the bigger picture, but also kind of the longer term needs.
Julianne, can I get you to pull your microphone close? Thank you.
Sure, sorry
Thanks.
about that.
Thanks.
So we have a reference to it currently. We can add another reference specific to this if you'd like. We will be seeing in January, I expect, a preferred scenario that I think is a hybrid of the three that you saw in July that the council has been working on. And so they'll come and talk to us about it and see what we think, and we'll want to make sure it's consistent both with, those regional goals, but also with our local plan.
Yeah, I don't feel like you necessarily need to add another reference just for my sake. It's good to know that it exists in there
Thanks.
somewhere.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Mine's just a
Yes.
comment, Mr. Chair.
Okay, let's go to James and then Andrew.
I guess 'tis the season, right? And I just want to commend the transit of the past, present, and future on this plan. I mean, this is a remarkable thing that's finally coming to fruition, and kudos to the Transportation Division for getting this done and the work that you've put into it. I know it's no small feat, especially when we have 7 individuals that have their own ideas as well, but you can see the streetcar is important to us, and it's important to the city. We've made a huge investment, and moving forward, I think that we've made that perfectly clear that that's got to be in this plan. So thank you.
Thanks, James. Andrew?
Thank you.
I echo those statements. I also had a question about number 1, include adequate access to the International Center. Do you have a sense of what we mean by that, with adequate, I guess? Or how we would judge that in the future, or any guideposts?
I can talk a little bit about 2 items that we're really getting at with respect to the International Center. One of them is transportation management organizations, wherein employers have a little more control over their own destiny, and this includes those in the International Center. But the other is the change to the Mountain View Corridor Transit project, and that would provide kind of express, so limited stop service, very frequently all day, and probably with hours of operation that go beyond what we see in the transit system currently, because schedules are different. In general, in that part of the city, there's just a longer span during which service is needed.
Mm-hmm.
So we emphasize that in the revised plan.
Okay. And my ongoing concern has been not easily rectified with the industrial center on the south of I-80, but the west part of the city, that we've only been able to identify employee shuttles, essentially. And I know it's called out here to make sure it's east and west side, because it also includes what Charlie's talked about on the East Bench, not having much in this transit plan. But it is sort of that hole that I'm still worried about, that I don't know that we rectify in this plan at this point, because it's such a broad scope. But I want to make sure it doesn't get dropped, because I'm very, very concerned about that area. Not just the northwest quadrant, which is undefined and will be flexible about that, but we're probably about 80+% built out in the industrial center now, somewhere in there, maybe almost 90%. In that industrial area out there. And I don't know how we, in the near future, talk with the regional transportation and have a plan that incorporates that more specifically. Talk specifically about how we're going to handle that. So, but thank you very much for this. I'm happy with it as it sits right now otherwise. Thanks.
So, council members, any other modifications to those recommended changes to the text? We're all good with it, with those corrections. Can we adopt this evening with those corrections?
So what I'm hearing is adopt the motion, adopt the ordinance to adopt the master plan with the revisions as written. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's
Okay.
what.
Except for the one that we
Except for the
straw polled to remove.
modifications, we did strike a piece.
Oh, yes. Okay, yes. Short answer is there'll be a motion sheet on the dais for each of you. So,
Russell, you just made my day. And transportation, Thank you. I want to just reiterate what James has said. This is a really big deal and a first-time opportunity for Salt Lake City. So thank you for all your hard work. John, thank you for all your hard work on this. And you get to take all the credit since it gets adopted on your watch.
Take all the credit you're willing to give.
Yeah, you get to totally take all the credit for this. And I know there was a lot of effort that went into this. So thank you. Please thank all of your staff for the efforts. I would be remiss if I didn't remind everybody this is a partnership with the UTA, in particular with funding, and going forward, a lot of the recommendations require a strengthened relationship with UTA. So, great. We look forward to seeing a motion this evening then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Russell. Next item on our agenda is item number 5, a budget amendment number 1 for fiscal year. This is wrapping up this budget amendment. There were some additional questions, and so I'm going to let Jennifer jump right into a couple of issues that she had some follow-up on, and then we'll open it up for final questions and comments.
Yeah, as far as staff knows, all of the items have been straw polled. There were just 2 items where there was new information since last week, so we just wanted to quickly touch on that new information, both relating to the Pioneer Park funding request and then also new information relating to the funding for police officers, which the council straw polled last week. So first I'll get to the Pioneer Park new information, and then Ben will cover the new information on the police staffing. So the staff is just providing this information so the record's clear about what public processes have been in place for this latest implementation plan phase of the Pioneer Park planning, so to speak. There has been an administrative process for the implementation plan. Sorry, yes. Oh, okay, sorry, it looked like you were saying something. There has been an administrative process for the implementation plan, but not a council process. The last process that the council went through was to adopt the first part, the first 2 parts of the master plan in 2006 that's separate from this implementation plan. So the only process that the council's had for this implementation plan phase of Pioneer Park is this budget opening. We did look at the last council minutes of the implementation plan when it was first discussed for the council. It was sort of an initial briefing, and the intention at that point was to go out and get some additional public input, specifically listed on Open City Hall, and then bring it back to the council for discussion. I think that it's being brought back to the council for discussion now is our understanding. But staff has checked, and it has not appeared on Open City Hall since the last council discussion, even though that was discussed. So the council might want to consider doing that at some point in the future.
So council members, this is something, and I apologize, this happened at in this short little interval when I was not here last week, and it's something that I was concerned about because my recollection of the Pioneer Park proposal was that we had not really adopted this implementation strategy that had been presented to the council and the RDA board, but that there was supposedly some follow-up engaging the public, and I wasn't sure that had happened, so the staff had researched that, and it does not appear that we went out to the public for their input and comments on that piece. And so I just kind of flagged it because I thought that we had made a commitment, we potentially had made a commitment to a public process that I'm not sure we followed. And so I was wondering if perhaps that's something we might want to delay action on until next budget opening because of that process question. It passed straw poll last week, but I just want to throw it out there for you to see if anybody is interested in reconsidering. It doesn't look like anybody is.
Mr. Chair, can I
Yes.
just throw one thing in there? I think it is really distressing to me that new information number 2, that the health department hasn't cited public services for public health issues. And to me, you don't wait to make sure it's clean once you're cited. So I'm I'm really wanting to see that those restrooms get cleaned regularly, not just May to October. And I know that's an expense, but I think that's, I don't want to see a public health risk there. And that is just that number 2 just is a red flag for me. Well, we haven't been cited, so we're okay.
And to be, I think that the porta potties are cleaned in the winter months, just not 7 days a week. They're cleaned 5.
5, right. But, so you just hope you're not there on the 2 days it doesn't get cleaned, I guess is my concern, so.
Well,
anyway.
you know,
Yeah.
I was gonna make a rude comment. I'm not going to do it. I won't do it. It had to
I'm
do
just
with
pointing that out. That's a concern I have.
Any other concerns about the process? If not, we'll move forward with that as straw polled last week.
Okay.
Okay.
The next item is relating to the police.
Actually, I do have one question, Mr. Chair. Have we heard anything from else from the administration of the Pioneer Park Coalition? Are we still pretty sure that the commitment stands?
Well, in the motion, it
Cool.
says, A12 says Operation Rio Grande using, I'm sorry. It says Pioneer Park improvements implementation rescoping using $544,000 of CIP funds along with $300,000 in financial contributions from the Pioneer Park Coalition.
All right. As long as that's clearly stated. And I have no reason to think that the Pioneer Park Coalition is going back on their word. It's just, that's the, that's really the first offer, or the first amount of money that we've had, someone offer to contribute. So I think it's pretty cool.
Mr. May I ask one question about that, real clarifying? Was it up to or was it 300? Because I thought the wording was up to based on the cost needed, not just a flat 300.
I tried to straw poll it at just the flat, but they said, I got pushed back on the.
It was up
They're
to.
like, oh, no, it has to be up to, so.
Okay, thank you.
It's up to. Let me just take a chair privilege here and say I'm very distressed by the number of trees being removed in this proposal. Okay, now let's move on.
Next is the new information or refined information on the police staffing proposal. There's a whole bunch of new numbers.
So as a reminder, the council straw polled updating the staffing document with 50 new entry-level police officers, including fully funding all of the equipment. And since then, last Friday, some council members met with police, finance, and the chief of staff, and it came to our attention that there are 9 civilian positions to support the 50 additional police officers. And we've summarized them in this little table. It's 1 quality assurance manager for the crime lab. This is a new position, and an important thing to note is this would help the city's crime lab move toward accreditation. There's been word that federal courts are planning to move in a few years to only accepting evidence from accredited crime labs, and so it might be in the city's interest to start moving toward that goal. The additional positions are also 3 crime lab technicians, 2 crime intelligence analysts, 2 records clerks, and 1 victim advocate. The total cost for these positions for a full year salary and benefits is estimated at $526,000. And so the question is, does the council support adding these additional 9 FTEs to the staffing document along with funding, or do you want them to take the place of some of the officers in the 50?
So let's split that into 2 different things. Before we get to this, I do have a couple questions, Ben. We talked a little bit about the necessary timing for these positions, and are these positions that need to be funded and hired now, or is this something that would make sense incorporating into a next fiscal year budget, with the reality that it's going to take 3 months to hire people anyway, so let's have them a July 1. Are officers going to come online in a time frame that sort of drives the need to hire these before the next fiscal year?
I would defer to the administration, but I can tell you that the crime lab does have a backlog of some evidence, so those...
But we may be talking about issues not related to the addition of 50 officers.
Correct.
And I see the chief sitting out there, and I'm going to ask him to come up if you don't mind, Chief.
And as he's on his way up, Chief Brown, can you share with the other council members what you shared with Andrew and with me on Friday about how long it takes to get results from fingerprints with the present number of people we have.
And so as you're addressing that, Chief, one of the things that I think is important to distinguish is between sort of what your current needs are and what additional needs you may have based on additional officers.
Okay. Well, thank you. Good evening, Council. We met with Councilmember Adams and Councilmember Johnson on Friday and talked about kind of the needs of the department and where we were at. And some of the crime lab needs are huge. We send people out to process crime scenes, and they collect fingerprints. They then take them back. But because of the backlog into the system, it takes them sometimes months. And when I was talking to them, sometimes it's 8 months. So if they had a suspect, the suspect wouldn't be back to the detective to solve the crime until almost 3/4 of a year from now. Most crimes, most criminals are transient, so where would we find these people? We brought in Mike Garvey, who is he's the Major City Chief's crime lab specialist. He runs the board, and he actually did an audit of our crime lab. And he came back and said, you would do very well if you would increase some of your staffing levels within your crime lab, because they do what you want to do is evidence or CSI-based policing, where if you had a burglary, you could take those prints, you could have them back to the detective within 2 or 3 days, and hopefully have a match on who this person might be and go collect them up so that you could stop that burglary trend or that hot spot. And so that is what we were looking for. I think.
So, Chief, which components of this are related to your current needs, and which components would be related to the added workload that would be related to new officers?
To your first question, the new officers, we're gearing up right now to hire 20 to 30 in January. But they won't be on the street until June, July.
But they'll be on the payroll.
They'll be on the payroll.
Right.
So
Okay.
as far as a need, we need them now, but we would need them, we
Okay.
need these positions probably in the next fiscal budget.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Because those officers won't be on the street quite yet.
Okay. But you also referenced that you currently have a need for additional, because you have a backlog.
Right.
And is it that technicians that help you with that backlog?
It's the technicians right now.
All right. Yes. Lisa, did you have your concerns addressed?
I just had a follow-up on that. So do you want, if we were to include this $526,000, are you wanting to propose that should be in this budget amendment, or should this be something we should be prepared for in the budget for the next fiscal year?
I think it probably would be better to look at it in the next fiscal year.
Here's what I would propose, and we can straw poll it if we need to, that we modify the staffing document so that it incorporates these positions, and then potentially look at funding in the next fiscal year. But by modifying the staffing document now, it provides some flexibility for doing things like advertising the position and gearing up and getting ready. It helps them organize with the staffing document approved. So we could modify the staffing document and not fund the positions until the next budget cycle, if that works for you.
Sure.
But
No,
I'm
that
hearing you might need a couple of crime lab technicians soon. Yes.
I don't have a motion, but I will say that a few months, well, no, it's been more than that. It's been several months back. I had the opportunity with several of you to visit the crime lab, and at the time there was, it was expressed that there was a backlog, that there needed to be work done. I think from some of the conversations that I had with those of you who were there at the time, we knew that is something that we wanted to look at. So, I think keeping, I don't know, how long would it take to hire the quality assurance manager for the crime lab and the crime lab technician?
Tim, what do
The
you
three
think on
of
that
them.
one?
It would probably take 2 to 3 months.
So, Aaron, do you want to make a?
Mr. Chair,
let's go to James first, and then.
How many current crime labs are accredited in the state?
How many what?
How many crime labs are currently accredited?
One.
There's
Just
only
the
one. It's
state, the
of
state crime
Utah.
lab, yeah.
So, and how far behind are they? How far is their backlog?
Just as bad as ours.
So when I came into it, you and I had a discussion of, maybe this is the opportunity for us to staff it and make it an accredited lab so
Right.
that we can start outsourcing and actually make this so it pays for itself or somewhat gets some sort of income to cover the costs. Have you done an analysis on that of reaching out to other jurisdictions to find out if that's something that they would be willing to jump ship and come to ours?
We've had some limited conversations, but you're absolutely right. We have a jewel of a crime lab out there. We just need the staffing to turn it into what it really can be. The potential's there, and I thank you for coming out and looking at it and recognizing that. So if we had the staffing in a few of these key positions, we would move that forward.
So I guess my request would be, Chief, is that find out exactly how much potential we could actually make in covering these costs of these employees being hired by doing the outsourcing through other jurisdictions. I think for me that would be key because I know how far behind we are, and if we are the second accredited lab in the state, that people are going to start sending stuff to us. So I think that we could have some sort of outsource way of making that pay for itself.
So if, a question on that, Mr. Chair. If we were to do that though, I think if we still were accredited, our stuff would still have the prioritization, correct? I mean, we wouldn't have to reprioritize or
Right.
anything like that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, I do see the benefit of having an accredited crime lab. I hesitate, especially with public safety, to start outsourcing a lot of the information that goes through the crime lab. I'd rather maintain some control on that. If others want to participate and use our crime lab, if it works for our caseload and everything else, and I'm fully supportive of that, but I get a little bit worried when we start talking about outsourcing stuff because it works until it doesn't, and then when it doesn't, it is a disaster.
Well, maybe clarify, I don't think you meant outsourcing, meaning sending our stuff out. You meant using our resource to help people come in.
So
And that's fine as long as we have that prioritization.
And so I think what would be required there, we'd need a fee structure and some sort of ability to prioritize that so that we don't bump our priorities for contract work. So basically, we'd be talking about contract work. Can I just ask you quickly about the victim advocate? Can you tell me a little bit about that position and what your needs are for that right now?
Well, I think we have 3 right now, and all but 1 are grant funded. And so it's always trying to balancing those grants and making sure that they're renewed so that we could keep them going. And their work, I mean, as we do more outreach and more advocate work, I think it's something we should really fund and go forward with.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Is it my turn?
It is your turn.
I want to take us back to our decision we made last week to add 50, and that the recognition that we did with that unanimous straw poll was that our neighborhoods need beat officers staffing them, that we need more ability with your staffing levels to respond proactively in neighborhoods. And we recognize that there are other needs that outside of patrol that are probably in great demand in your department. And we had only talked about that there may be some supervisor needs for an expanded patrol unit.
Very few, but yeah.
And I'm just wondering why we aren't seeing any of those in this proposal. Or
We're going to take the officers that you're giving us, and we're going to put them on existing squads. So we're not going to form new squads. We're just going to make the squads a little bit bigger. And so with our span of command, our span of control being 5 to 7, most of our squads now are at 5 or 6, and so we can add 1 or 2 to those squads and not have to increase supervision.
you can grow by 25% of your patrol numbers.
Yeah.
And absorb it within your existing supervisor roles.
And our plan is to actually take those officers. They won't be on the street until June or July. And we'll have our ICP study back by then, our organizational study, and then we'll tell us how many supervisors we need. And then we'll go through the normal process to get those people reclassified if we need them, because we don't know if we do or not.
You see, we have 5 bike squads of 6 officers each, so we could grow those we could put 2 on every one of those squads or more.
Mr. Chair, this is an important piece. I think you should probably bring about the study that you talked about, because that's important to knowing how these will be utilized and what the need actually is. Just if you wouldn't mind
Yeah,
sharing
no,
that.
I mean, this is such a great gift that you're giving us, and we want to do it right. I mean, we have a great police department, but as we structure this with some of these very important civilian positions, I think this study will give us everything we need to know as far as organizational structure, from the top down, where we should be putting people, how many officers should be on each beats, to include detective squads, because we have really never had a way to measure that and where it should be, and then as to when and how you deploy those officers into patrol. I mean, what should your day shift look like? What should your afternoon shift look like? Weekends, all those critical things. So this is a very granular, deep dive into a police department as to what it needs for to be the most proficient organization it can be.
So,
Can I finish my my pitch here?
Yeah.
Which is that these positions, I recognize these additional positions are important to the overall work that the police department's able to do. I am cost sensitive at this point from what we took on last week, and it sounds like we have some consistency, and I'd love to hear otherwise, on the need to staff our crime lab such that it can become an accredited lab and managed that way. So with regard to that, I'd like to make a straw poll.
Okay, so before you do, can you hold it for a second? Because
Sure.
there's a couple things I want to just make sure we make a very clear statement. And the first one is that these positions and any other support positions are above and beyond the number 50 of new officers. And I want to confirm that that is our position, that the additional support staff is not included in our original straw poll of 50 new positions.
Straw poll
Well,
that.
that
I
was
do.
gonna be my straw poll.
Was it? Okay, well, let's do that right now. All those who support that, thumbs up. Any who oppose it, thumbs down.
Mr. Chair, I was texting.
The straw poll is reconfirming our position from last week that we are adding 50 new officers, and that any additional support staff, regardless of where they are, we will consider separately. But we are not including support staff as part of the 50 new officers. Thumbs up if you support that, thumbs down if you do not. That is unanimous. So, Aaron, now on these positions.
Well, the other part of what I was gonna say, Mr. Chair, is that
I'm trying to perfect my mind reading skills, but clearly I'm off tonight, so.
that we accept in today's budget amendment the inclusion of the quality assurance manager for the crime lab position, the 3 crime lab technician positions, and the victims advocate position, and consider the crime intelligence analyst and records clerk positions in an upcoming budget amendment or in the general fund.
I think that's a great proposal. So I also will, after straw polling this, I would like to propose a straw poll that we include all of these positions in our staffing document now. So, so the straw poll from Councilmember Mendenhall is quality assurance, 3 crime lab technicians, and a victims advocate. Is that accurate?
Yes.
With the other positions funded as part of the next fiscal year budget proposal. Any questions? Yes, Andrew.
This is related but not direct to it. I'm very, very concerned about our where our budget sits at this point. I think with the estimated decrease in our revenue and the budget opening now, what we know, not including this, although this might be part of it, we're sitting just above 10%. And that's a worry to me. I understand we're treating these separately, but I want to make sure that's kept in context with our decision about this budget amendment, that doing this also means that, in my view, we have an obligation to raise that up, and that means somewhere else we have to find that. So I don't want to separate these out too closely, because I agree with Councilmember Mendenhall that I'm very cost conscious at this point. This is important, but it's also taking away from any buffer we had in our budget this fiscal year. So,
Mr. Chair, can I respond to that? I'm going to take that as a yes, that we will, I think that this is something we need to address quickly. And I support your concern and share it, and believe that we should look to addressing these real questions about how we grow our revenue in the new year quickly.
sure, and I don't mean too much, but I'm also looking at, if we're looking at growing revenue, we're looking at bonding, and this directly affects our ability to do that. And so
Yeah.
I want to make sure I have that conversation right now concurrently with this.
So I appreciate that concern. I think council members share that concern about our 10% threshold. So we have a straw poll before us that we, in this budget opening, fund quality assurance manager for the crime lab, 3 crime lab technicians, and a victim's advocate. Any questions to that? So we're going to straw poll that. All those in favor, thumbs up. Any opposed? Thumbs down. So it looks like we're unanimous with that. So a clarification, Chief. Well, no, before we do that, one more straw poll that all these positions be included in our current staffing document, regardless of funding.
And by all, you mean the full list of 9?
The full list up here. So that's, council members, pay attention. The next straw poll is that we include all of these positions, regardless of funding, in our staffing document immediately. Any questions to that straw poll? All those in favor, thumbs up. Any opposed? Thumbs down. Okay. Chief, a clarification. When you suggested those other positions could be funded at a future date, I was hearing next fiscal year in the budget process. There's a question raised about whether or not you were thinking next budget opening. I see next fiscal year
fiscal
works
year.
for you. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
I would just want to share with the other council members that one thing that you can also probably be looking to for the budget in the future, probably in line with when the new officers come on, or maybe in the first budget opening of the next fiscal year, would be additional prosecutors. Because if you're arresting more people, you're going to need that, so that will be an additional.
So clearly Lisa has perfected her mind reading skills, because that was my thought as well. And I was wondering if I could get Margaret. Is Margaret back there?
Yeah.
Margaret, could you come up and address that? Because I've been thinking about the concerns of additional workload that 50 new officers are likely to bring on in other areas of the criminal justice system.
And you and I can bring it up because we won't have to find a way to pay for it.
And I know this is putting you on the spot. I apologize, but could you give us sort of a quick view of what that might include in the way of additional workload?
Sure, I've got some rough estimates from the prosecutor's office, and I also reached out to the Justice Court once I heard about the proposal, just because it was clear to me that those groups would be impacted. Now, of course, part of it depends on how the officers are assigned, but based on what you all have been saying, if they're patrol officers, it will absolutely impact the prosecutors and our Justice Court. So the estimate is that a 14% increase in patrol officers, or 25 really, if it's just patrol officers, will result in at least 2,300 more filings out of about 16 or 17,000. At a minimum, the prosecutor's office estimates that they will probably need an additional prosecutor and 2 support staff. The support staff obviously help with discovery and moving the cases through the system. I have not heard back specifically from the Justice Court, and obviously they make their own budget proposals, but I think it's only safe to assume that if they're processing, the prosecutor's office has a 5 to 10% declination rate. So if these officers write 2,300, 2,500 more citations, there's a 10% declination rate. That's still a big impact on the Justice Court, so I think it's safe to assume another clerk at a minimum, but again, I haven't talked to them directly.
And so the reality with the timing for when these officers actually hit the street, that would make sense to do in the next fiscal year, correct?
I think that's right.
But it's something that we'd have to absolutely consider in the budget process for the next fiscal year. And when I say we, I'm sorry, that's the royal we, meaning somebody else, not me.
And there's one additional impact that goes with that, of course, and again, it's not under my purview, it's under finances, but whether it has an impact on our contract with the Legal Defenders Association, because of course we want to make sure to adequately fund that. So it's just a trickle-down effect on all three of those entities.
Any questions for Margaret? Okay. Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you.
So Ben has handily calculated the 4-month cost of the positions that you straw polled adding budget for, not all 9 positions, but the crime lab tech, and victim advocate. That's assuming hiring in March. So that's what would be added to the budget for this fiscal year, and then all the FTEs would be added to the staffing document.
Any questions about that? Ben, you are a whiz on the fly, so thank you for that. Jennifer, anything else? That concludes the...
Sorry, Mr. Chair, there are a couple more.
Oh, you do have one?
So when the council took their straw poll, it was to purchase the vehicles for all 50 police officers. We've since had new information about a leasing option so that the 50 vehicles could be put on a 3-year lease where the city would own them after the 3 years. This would save approximately $932,000 from fund balance this fiscal year, but leasing is more expensive in the long term. Finance estimates the leasing would be about $57,000 more over the 3-year lease than just buying them outright.
And sorry, just to clarify, a lease in the city terminology is different than lease in our sort of private lives. It just means financing the purchase of a vehicle rather than funding it all up front.
It's not actually a lease where you get to turn it in after 3 years and get to go to a new leased car. It's actually purchase.
Right.
But over time.
Right.
So the question, council members, is do you want to stick with the straw poll as you did last week, including purchase, or do you want to reconsider leasing it to save some money the first year but costing more in future years?
Mr. Chair, Mary Beth, you want to, or John, either one of you maybe could come up. My understanding was that while that is true that it costs more, that often we are still paying on cars that are no longer useful. Did I get that right when we discussed it?
So in the past, that is correct. What we have come up with this time is a 3-year lease. Usually the leases have been 5 to 7 years. A police vehicle will last only 5 years. If we do a lease for 3 years, on the 4th and 5th year, you can either sell it. The county sells theirs for about $12,900 on the end of the 3rd year. Or we can continue to use those vehicles for the next 2 years and then rotate in new vehicles at that point in time. So I think we have an option after that 3-year lease. It's one of the reasons we came back with a 3-year lease versus a 5 or a 7, because obviously a 7-year lease means that the cars are way beyond, and we're paying for something that's way beyond its useful life.
We're still making payments on cars that are typically in the shop.
Correct.
Or not usable.
Correct.
Yeah.
Whereas a 3-year lease makes more sense because you can still use that vehicle for maybe 2 years. And you may be able to use it as a rotating vehicle. You may be able to sell it. There's a lot of options after your 3-year lease.
Mary Beth, when you look at the more comprehensive issues regarding fleet overall, does leasing versus purchasing outright make any difference in the big picture of fleet?
If I had all the money in the world,
you could control the world, yes.
Yeah, if I could control the world, I would buy all vehicles outright. But obviously I can't. And, you know, I, like Andrew, am very nervous about my fund balance because, you know, it's like I said in the small group session is that rating agencies are looking at us significantly. And every time you go in for a bond rating agency, they scrutinize every single thing we do. And one of the biggest things that we can control is our fund balance. So the higher fund balance we have, the better off we're going to be. So if I had all the money in the world, yes, I would buy. That would be my answer.
So the question before us is, do we want to buy now or kick the can? Save some money and kick the can, because you don't save money long term, you save money short term.
Can you remind us the difference first year again? The cost
Nine-
difference again?
$932.
$932?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's significant. So,
And then it's 57,000 over the life of the lease.
does somebody want to make a straw poll proposal?
Mr. Chair, I move that we save money and lease the vehicles.
So,
Short term, and it's only 57,000 over. I mean, it's going to protect the fund balance a lot more than if we were to go outright.
okay, but it does impact next fiscal year.
Correct.
Yes.
Does.
So the straw poll before us would be to lease rather than purchase outright. Saves a considerable amount of money this fiscal year, but will cost more long term.
And because, sorry, just to note, for the immediate next fiscal year, it would mean that the structural deficit would be increased for the immediate next fiscal year, because instead of purchasing things outright, you're spreading it over 3 years.
Right.
So
all those, everybody understand? All those in favor, thumbs up. And those opposed, thumbs down. Looks like we have 4 thumbs down. The thumbs ups were James, Lisa, and Charlie. So it looks like we stick with the previous straw poll. Sorry, Mary Beth.
Okay.
You're going to have some faith. Okay. Anything else?
One more.
Ben.
This
Last
is-
time you said one more.
I suppose this is not a straw poll as much as an important disclosure about the funding mechanism. So we are adding the 50 FTEs for the police to the staffing document. But the funding is going to be split because the training academy can only be 30 officers for best practices, but you're hiring 50, and there are currently 6 vacancies for officers. So the first hiring class, starting in January, is going to be the 6 vacancies plus 24 of the new officers. So those 24 are going to need a half-year funding. And the remaining 26 could start the academy as early as April, and so they would have a quarter-year funding.
So it actually saves some money over the original proposal.
Correct.
How much?
I think it's about $1 million.
Yeah.
It's okay if Ben keeps going with additional items that save us money.
Yeah. So there's $1 million to cover the purchase of those vehicles. Oh, Mary Beth's coming up. What's she going to say? Mary Beth's going to take our money away. Yeah.
Approximately $300,000 is what it saves us,
It saves about $300,000. Okay.
There we go.
which is a decent amount.
It's
nothing.
yeah, it's significant.
Nothing.
Okay. So
we just wanted to disclose in case there was an
We're-
expectation that 50 would show up at the same time. And so
yeah, I'm not sure any of us had that expectation, but I think recruiting. I'll look to the chief for this, but recruiting is going to be a challenge for 50 individuals too. So,
Mr. Chair, I think there's also a turnover issue there where you're anticipating 20 or so in the next year, theoretically, of retirement. We're moving on. So there'd be an offset in some way that's hard to predict at this point, but it could also be in flux. So the actual total number increase may not happen very
we
quickly.
did have a remind me where we were with Councilmember Mendenhall's suggestion or request to look at some potential incentives to retain people who are up for retirement. Did we straw poll that or move forward or?
No, we worked in small groups with administration and chief, and ultimately we arrived at the 50 proposal.
Okay. All right. Good. Thanks. And yet,
But
Dan, do you have one more?
Can I
Okay.
just
Yes.
mention what happened earlier in our RDA discussion, which I don't think the chief or assistant chief were here for, where we discussed the possibility and legality of looking into working police and fire housing opportunities into our affordable housing projects that we're looking at funding, which could be an incredible incentive tool for recruitment for the police department, although it's several steps down the
I think
path.
Lisa, both Lisa and Cindy have a follow-up on that.
Cindy was just sharing with me, because I expressed concern, legally, could we do that? And we can. So that is great news.
Okay. There you go.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
Yes, Charlie.
And on that, while Aaron and I and others did have conversations about looking at retention opportunities and trying to work with the police department, even though we ended up deciding on the 50-officer model right now, I fully anticipate that, in the coming months and leading up to the budget, that we are still going to be interested in figuring out what we can do for existing officers and working on some of the retention issues, even though the biggest barrier to public safety retention right now, actually public employee retention, is state law that redid the state retirement system. So if we really want to get to the bottom of retention, that's something that we're going to have to look at from a statewide level, and it's something that I hope that we will pursue.
It sounds like something that would be worth taking to the league, because it's not unique to Salt Lake City. It's a shared issue across all municipalities. So, any more?
Nope, we'll have a motion sheet across the hall for you guys to consider for
You're
tonight.
the best. So this is another check it off for action this evening. Great. Don't go anywhere. I don't think we need you, because if any one of these people sitting up here is going to propose a modification to what we did at the RDA earlier today, I will hunt them down and probably kill them.
I've got a modification, Mr.
But
Chairman.
I don't think we need to discuss item number 6, because we are assuming the proposal agreed upon earlier is what we're moving forward with.
Right, and we'll also have a motion sheet for you guys to consider across the hall that addresses the city portion of that, accepting the money into the Housing Trust Fund.
Okay, so across the hall, we have a public hearing.
Yes.
On this component, and a possibility of suspending our rules and adopting this evening. So, okay. Any questions about that? Council members, we do not have tentative homeless check-in. We do not have a Northwest Quadrant check-in. We do have some announcements. Do we? Maybe we don't have some announcements. I probably read that wrong. No, we don't. No, we don't have announcements. Unless someone corrects me, we don't have announcements. We do. We'll have to do that for next week's announcements, because we didn't get it in time for the agenda today. But I think we will adopt a schedule for next year, or see a schedule for next year at next meeting. There's some timing issues they're working out. Okay, we don't have a closed session. Our work session is adjourned. We will reconvene across the hall for our formal meeting at 7 o'clock. Thank you.